communards.
Yes.
Communards?
Yeah, it almost sounds like communist. Yeah, and Frederick Engels was there. Yeah.
Bakunin was there.
Yeah, also.
And on that note, folks, welcome. Thanks for joining us. This is Uncivil Disobedience, and I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. With me, as always, is my co-host and partner in crime, Kennedy Cooper. And our guest tonight is historian and independent journalist, Alex Suarez. Go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience like they don't know you, Alex.
Sure. So part of what inspired me to enter journalism, study journalism, become an investigative or independent journalism of sorts was Julian Assange, the foundation of WikiLeaks. And ultimately, after completing my bachelor's degree, initially wanted to pursue my master's also in communications or journalism. And I ended up having a change of major to history. And part of that was also motivated by what happened to Assange and how I was so pissed, at the, people call them mainstream media. I call them the lamestream media, but, the bourgeois press, whatever you want to call them. And, how they portrayed Assange and made it about him and made it about personality rather than all the incredible things that his organization was revealing. And so getting fed up with how I was treated at college papers, how I was censored, how Assange was being treated, how real journalists that wanted to expose crimes were being treated. I changed majors. So now I'm into history. I've always been passionate about history. Had the honor last year to meet the father and brother of Julian Assange, had lengthy conversations with them, including about Alex Saab, who I'm going to have the pleasure to speak about today as well, who's another one of my heroes. And of course, Dr. King as well. We happen to have it on MLK Day, but it'll be good. It'll be an honor to get the truth out there to your listeners.
And, and truth is something that it can be hard to find these days. So I appreciate you joining us tonight. And go ahead and start by telling people about Alex Saab. I think most people know who Julian Assange is, but I have a feeling that fewer people have heard of Alex Saab, and that's a great place for us to start.
Just in case you see the two posters in the background, some people might think I put up this Assange and Saab poster just for the show. No, this is what I see every day. This is my room. They're a constant reminder that you have to keep up the fight for them. And anybody who sees my Twitter, they see that my Twitter handle says free Saab, free Assange. They're such important cases, just like Donziger and all the other political prisoners. And, I had the honor late last year to meet the wife of Alex Saab when I went down to Venezuela for the first time. I was able to be a witness to their regional elections, which they called the mega elections. There was approximately 500 internationals that were there, and it was an honor to take part in that. And so in June of 2020, the Trump regime kidnapped Alex Saab. Now, it has been proven that Alex Saab was a diplomat since 2018. So what the U.S. and the right-wing press are claiming about Saab now is that they only gave him diplomatic status after he was captured in Cape Verde. Mm-hmm. That's not true. I actually knew of Alex Saab's effort as a diplomat and a businessman before he was captured. He was known. He'd been on television with Chavez back when he was alive in Venezuela. He grew up in Venezuela. He was born in Colombia, but he spent most of his life in Venezuela. And he was known to people that were paying attention to the politics of Venezuela. I'm fluent in Spanish. He was known as a diplomat and as a humanitarian, as a businessman, as a progressive that was helping the people of Venezuela fight the sanctions since 2018. And there's documentation that proves that he was a diplomat of the Bolivarian government of Venezuela since 2018, and also knew Chavez back in 2013 before he died. So he was an active supporter of the Venezuelan government and became a diplomat through his connections in the Middle East. He comes from Middle East origin. And so he was able to use these connections to fight U.S. sanctions and literally save millions of lives. There's a program called CLAP, who approximately 9 million Venezuelans depend on to survive. It's kind of like our food stamps here. But this is how important it is, because the vicious criminals, unilateral sanctions of the United States above any other government that are imposing on the Venezuelan people would have resulted in more than 100,000 deaths. So Venezuela's population is pretty low. So we know from the latest UN report, they said a couple years ago it was 40,000. As of late last year, 100,000 Venezuelans have been killed by us. Now, if you compare the figures, and that would have been in the millions if it wasn't for Saab, that's a fact. But if you compare our population size, right, with Venezuela's, it would be the equivalent of us losing 30 million Americans. Okay, and 30 million happens to be the approximate number of Russians that were killed by the Nazi advance, and they sacrificed more than any other nation during World War II. So we hear 100,000, we're comparing it to our population. Venezuela's population is not that big. But that 100,000 would have been 2, 3, maybe 4 million deaths from starvation, lack of medical supplies, people that are relying on cancer medications. Alex Saab is a cancer survivor. He was denied his stomach cancer medication. He was tortured, beaten every night by the Cape Verde authorities on orders from Trump and later from Biden. He could be tortured in Miami. He's been extradited there. I went to the arraignment before I went to Venezuela in mid-November. But it's a miracle this guy's still alive. And why were they torturing him? They were trying to get dirt on Maduro, and he refused to speak. And so there's a former senator from Colombia who's been in the news lately, mostly the Spanish press, so you probably haven't read it. I met her. I happened to meet her when I was in Caracas. Very respected. She did a lot to mend relations between Colombia and Venezuela. A former progressive senator named Piedad Cordova, that's her name. So she's been in the news lately because she revealed that the DEA recently offered her $10 million to speak against Maduro or Alex Saab or both. But the sum was $10 million. But they're dealing with a woman who's a progressive and a principled person, and so she exposed it to the world. But this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with criminal regimes. This is empire. It doesn't matter if it's Biden or Trump. For the act of defying the U.S. sanctions and saving millions of lives, rather than give him the Nobel Peace Prize, they're holding him. They had 8 charges against him. 7 of them were dropped. And word has been circulating that, that's because the Cape Verdean authorities convinced the United States to drop 7 of the 8 charges in exchange for giving him over to the United States. That's bullshit. Okay? So if the United Kingdom, with all their power and all their pride in the autonomy of their judicial system, is holding Assange in limbo like the U.S. wants him to, okay, because I have inside information. I'm pretty confident from what I've studied that the U.S. wants Assange in limbo. They want him psychologically tortured. The UN said he was tortured, just like Alex Saab. And so, because the UN did check when Alex Saab was in Cape Verde and confirmed he was tortured as well, although that was physical. He lost teeth. But with Assange, okay, so if the British, with all their power, has to succumb to the U.S. empire when it comes to keeping Assange in limbo, they haven't made their mind up whether they want to extradite him yet or not. Then the little island of Cape Verde off the coast of Africa that has no power, that's basically a vassal state of the United States, has the authority to negotiate 7 of the 8 charges against Ambassador Saab. By the way, diplomatic immunity, that's out the door. I mean, investigative journalism is dead. It's on his deathbed, but that's the death blow. That's the coup de grace the moment they bring Assange here. That's a fact. But with Saab, I mean, diplomatic immunity is out the window. I mean, already since this happened, the Ukrainian regime, that now emboldened by the backing of the Democrats again, the neo-Nazis, right? The Ukrainian regime, which is the fascistic neo-Nazi regime, has been ordering that the Russian ambassador be extradited from Belarus and sent to Ukraine. Why did that happen? Because they knew what happened with Alex Saab. So diplomatic immunity now is gone, even though the United States never signed on to the International Criminal Court, but is the signature of the Vienna Convention. All diplomats are at risk. And guess what? When I was at the Venezuelan Embassy of Washington in 2019, and they invaded that embassy illegally and arrested my comrades, that was also a violation of the Vienna Convention. It's all connected. And people were saying, wait and see. Biden's going to make an Iran deal like Obama. Biden's going to better the the conditions in Cuba like Obama did. A Democrat would never invade an embassy. A Democrat would never violate the Vienna Convention. And it's continue on. Only now they extradited Saab here.
And for the record, let's say, and be clear about this, Biden has lost the Iran deal for the United States by insisting that the Iranians agree to toughen it up before rejoining, despite the U.S. being the side that broke it in the first place. So Biden's State Department has already kissed the Iran deal goodbye when that was at least 1/3 of the argument that for us to vote for it.
See, people usually talk about sanctions as hurting people in other countries and in the third world, and I completely get down with that, and I'm in solidarity with the third world. But at the same time, it hurts us Americans.
Yes.
Because gas prices would immediately go down the same day that Biden starts to negotiate with the Iranians again. That Biden starts to negotiate with Venezuela, which has the number one oil reserve in the world.
Yeah.
The working class suffer more than anyone. The working class and the poor that are in parts of our society that has bad infrastructure, that can't get to work on time on buses, that has to rely on the gas. And by the way, gas prices also make bus fares increase. So even the very poor that can maybe get to work on time, their bus fees are going to go up because the gas prices continue to go up.
Yep.
But the American working class is suffering the high gas rate. And also, what about our freedom of movement? If I want to fly to see where Che Guevara is buried from the United States today, if I want to fly to Santa Clara, Cuba, I can't, because Trump, in order to say F you to Obama, made a stupid law that said if you enter Cuba, you can only go on airplane. You can't take a cruise, which is probably safer now with COVID, right? So people care less about that. But what about our freedom of movement if we want to fly directly to another city besides Savannah? Can't do it. Did Biden immediately reverse that? Did he bring back Obama's policy in that? No. I'm not trying to say that Obama's a saint, by the way, because Obama, with one word, with one tweet, he has tremendous influence over the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
With one tweet, Obama could put a stop to all this, what Biden's doing, that's ruining his legacy. Yeah. But he's silent. He's silent, and therefore he's complicit. So I'm not saying this is a defense of Obama. I'm just saying that people were expecting, some people were expecting.
And regardless of what you think of Obama, the Iran deal and the opening up towards Cuba were huge improvements over the previous state of affairs. Now, there's actually space to criticize the Iran deal from the left, saying we shouldn't be forcing other countries to agree to these sorts of things in order to let them pursue their own internal energy research. But at the same time, it's a huge improvement over the previous state of affairs.
This is part of the problem with liberalism, though, is that they open these doors a little bit and they say, well, we're going to keep opening it over time. And then actually, like 10 minutes later, they slam it shut.
Well,
like,
and that's what Biden did, is that Biden, he also is tougher on Cuba than Trump.
Exactly. And he made new sanctions against Nicaragua. I know people that observe the elections in Nicaragua. So for the sin of practicing democracy now, there are new sanctions that Trump didn't even have against Nicaragua.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Because and what is Cuba's sin? Wanting to trade vaccines?
Yeah, I mean, the vaccines that are sent to Venezuela, I can tell you firsthand, a lot of them are from Cuba because they invented their own vaccine despite the obstacles. A lot of them are from Russia and from China. I have been to Cuba. I haven't gone to Nicaragua yet. I'd love to go. But I wanted to get back to the charges against Assange. Against Saab real quick.
Mm-hmm.
So the point I was trying to make is the real reason why 7 of the 8 charges, which would have put him away for a long time, probably about the same as what Assange's sentence would be, like over 100 years. So why was 7 of the 8 charges dropped? They have no evidence. And so the least of all the charges, which is still up to 20 years in jail, because we have huge sentences in comparison to Latin America or Europe. We're like one of the top and the highest sentences in the world, even like, total authoritarian regimes, whatever you want to call.
But I mean, let's be honest. Once you're in the criminal justice system, the United States is pretty authoritarian.
Exactly. We're at the level of authoritarian regime. I'm talking about overt ones. We're also authoritarian.
Yeah.
We're just more covert in our style of authoritarian.
We have more prisoners. We have
yeah.
more prisoners in the U.S. than China, which is amazing considering China has more people.
And people say per capita. It's like, no, literal figures.
And and 2 states. This is the scariest part. 2 states in the U.S., Florida and Texas, execute more people over every year than China. And China has capital punishment for everything.
Actually,
I exaggerate a little bit.
What you just stated even surprises me. And you know I'm very cynical. And I'll tell you why. Because usually the justification people give with, well, China has so few less prisoners because they execute everybody. But what you just stated is interesting. They can't really say that anymore, can they? Because here in Florida and over in Texas, they execute even more than China. That's crazy.
Yep.
Well, so the thing to remember
is that it's in spite of the fact that China has like something like 30 times the number of capital offenses that we do. Like that.
Yeah, but their sentences are less, so they can probably do house arrest or I mean, it's not like our sentences work are completely authoritarian, right?
Well, it's like, and basically they have capital punishment for any crime that puts someone else's life in danger.
Well, they've actually executed bankers. Has that ever happened here? You know, I don't think so. But anyways, the lesser charge, just in case, is conspiring to launder money. So if anybody ever tells you that Alex Saab in Miami Herald and any other right-wing, Cuban-owned press, Cuban exile, that he's being charged right now with money laundering, no, it's conspiring to money launder. And so they have one false witness, so it's very vague, that apparently he met him one time and he said he wanted to conspire to launder money. That's all they got. Very, very flimsy.
Plus, let's
be honest. They kidnapped a diplomat over this.
Let's be honest. Money laundering in the context of a regime against which we have sanctions as a country, all that actually means is trying to bring money into the country in violation of sanctions now. It doesn't even mean actual laundering of money. It's basically a sanctions violation because you have to try to launder money to get it past the
What they're claiming in court, though, is that that Assad stole money from the Venezuelan people. And so when I was at a press conference in Venezuela, they mentioned this and they said, if Alex Saab really stole money from us, he would have been given the Presidential Medal of Honor because that's all the U.S. government has done to us. And literally there are hundreds, maybe thousands of Venezuelan exiles, rich guys that stole money from the Venezuelan people that are walking the streets of Miami and other parts of our country with the protection of the U.S. government.
Because they brought money with them.
Behind the sanctions. Whoever would believe such a thing, they have to be an idiot.
Well, all those Venezuelan bankers that Chavez was going to arrest not long before he died ran to Miami with as much money as they can carry so they could hang out with their Cuban exile buddies.
That's right. And so I don't know if you saw are either of you can read or understand Spanish a little bit?
I occasionally read Spanish media through translator, but not as much as I used to.
Yeah, so there's a Nuevo Herald. So Nuevo Herald is the new Miami Herald. It's the Miami Herald in Spanish. Mm-hmm. And they interviewed me back when Trump came to Miami in 2017. And I showed up with my chaser in Calle Ocho. Okay, so that's the center of the Cuban exile community. Trump's in the building across the street. We're the counter protesters. And these journalists are coming up to me, right-wing journalists. I know who they are. And they want to talk to me because there's the guy with the Chase shirt that they're trying to attack. And, there was cops there was a buffer or whatever. And they were expecting me to sound like an idiot, and they were so mad because I knew all my facts about Che. And I was so articulate. I got to show you that video translated for you. But it's funny because when I was walking around Caracas and I was telling them, I showed up in Miami with my Chase shirt, they were laughing. They all thought I was joking. It's like, no, there's a video of me like actually doing, because when you're an activist, you can't have fear. That's what I love so much about people like Assange. He doesn't let fear control him, and he's an inspiration. And so is Alex Saab, because they knew the risk and they continued to travel and to do what they were doing to save people, to save lives, whether it's war crimes, whether it's corruption, whether it's these vicious terroristic sanctions. And when I say terroristic, I don't use that lightly, because I wrote an article once. The textbook definition of terrorism is targeting a civilian population for political gain.
Whoa,
how is that not sanctions? How is that not economic terrorism?
Terrorism.
I think it sounds like a procedure, right? Like something we should really call it economic terrorism.
The United States is a terrorist state. It's been a terrorist state for a long time. There's a wonderful, well, I don't want to say wonderful because it's actually quite bone-chilling, but there is an excellent book called Rogue State by the late Bill Bloom that really drives home just what a terrorist state the United States has been.
You should really read Failed States by Chomsky. I've interviewed Chomsky once. Failed States is another good one.
I'll have to remember that.
And people that read it thought he was talking about the United States. When they asked him about it afterwards, he said it could have been the United States. Maybe it's not. But it's like everybody that read it automatically assumed the United States. Isn't that interesting that he didn't actually ever say in the book it was the United States that was the failed state he was describing? But that's how everybody interpreted it, including the right wing, including his critics. They said, "How dare you say this about the United States?" He never said the United States, but they're recognizing how the U.S. is becoming a failed state, even the people that were opposing him.
Of course. You can't deny it. I mean, and they're the ones who made it fail. They understand this.
There was a guy who was debating me once about Marx, right? I love debating. And he said, "I'm a capitalist." And I said, "You're influenced by Marx." He said, "What are you talking about? Marx invented the word capitalism." He was so pissed, but it's true. I mean, he couldn't dispute that.
That's pretty true. That is true, actually. And also, and this is something that even philosophy professors writing textbooks for state colleges during the Cold War had to admit, Marx invented social science.
Yep.
Through historical analysis of the Marxist historical analysis, he invented that type of social science. Absolutely.
Well, not even just that. He took all sorts of statistics and then used those statistics to make successful guesses about the way people lived. That is the soul of social science. He invented that process. He was the first one to actually show his work to that degree.
And do you know that he relied on Frederick Engels to pay for his rent in England?
Yeah.
Like he died with not a lot of money. He was a working class guy. So people want to say, Lenin was kind of bourgeois, and Marx himself was working class.
Well, it's important. It's important to qualify that. Marx himself could be called working class, but his wife was really rich.
Oh, I didn't know that, but yeah. Well,
yeah,
I know also that Engels
lived off his wife
supported him. Well, not just his wife, also Engels supported him.
He was supported by Engels pretty much before he got married, and he lived off his wife's money after he got married.
That's interesting. But what I do remember is that Engels was traveling to France. We were talking about this before the recording, because he had money and he traveled more than Marx, and he was able to be witness to the Paris Commune, and then Marx wrote a lot about that as well. So a lot of the Second French Revolution towards the 1870s, influenced Marx's thoughts, seeing the rise of the working class there.
Yeah.
And the term left, right, and center comes from the first French Revolution in the early 1800s.
Yep.
And what was the word I was talking about earlier? Mutual aid. So mutual aid first came up in political speaking during the Second French Revolution. So we can learn a lot from rapping with the French as well.
Definitely.
Another fun fact about how Marx got by in the world is that he was like an AMC Nokia stock bro. A lot of people don't know this, but he wrote about like how he found the stock market very amusing and like basically playing the capitalist game to his own ends, like amused him. Occasionally he made a few windfalls like that as well. So Marx did a lot of really funny things.
Let me tell you, nobody be better to beat a casino than a Marxist, right?
Right.
They detest capitalism. they want to use the system against them, then who better? I'm pretty sure this has happened, that a Marxist who's really good with math has gone into the slot machines and walked out with all this money and says, yes, class warfare. It works to my advantage.
There is, I don't know about that. I do know for a fact that people have been thrown at, people who know how to count cards get thrown out of casinos all the time because literally,
the MIT
student is counting cards.
He was a co-conspirator because he was teaching at MIT, but the MIT students went over Vegas.
They throw people out because counting cards eliminates the house's advantage.
Right.
Now, there's nothing wrong with counting cards. Counting cards is actually cheating. The whole point of games like blackjack.
Yep.
The card games like blackjack are literally called counting games.
Yeah.
Now,
and there's tons of non-gambling games where you're told to count cards too.
Yes.
I think it's worth noting, like traditional games like Hearts, you're supposed to count the cards.
Yeah.
That's how you play those games.
But casinos throw people out for counting cards at blackjack tables because counting cards eliminates the house's advantage.
Well, anyways, I wanted to bring back the Saab a little bit.
Yes.
So one of the original charges that they had against him, which I find it very racist, and they put this out there to taint the jury, the potential jury, because remember the Cuban Five that they claimed did espionage back in the 90s? As part of the deal with Obama, they were returned to Cuba.
Yeah.
Those Cuban Five political prisoners were tried by a Miami jury, which is full of exiles and right-wingers. So in order to taint the jury, one of the original charges, again, zero evidence for, was narco trafficking. And so, yeah, because he happened to be born in Colombia, it's like, well, of course.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's just so ridiculous. And then, I ran into the CNN Espanol journalist, CNN Spanish journalist, so-called journal, right? In the elevator at the arraignment for Saab. And this is interesting. So I go up to him and talk to him in Spanish. He doesn't want to give me his name. He's not sure what side I'm on. And then I said, so what do you think of the torture of Alex Saab? As soon as I said that and the elevator doors open, he took off running. And then I read his article later. I found out who he was. And there's a picture of Saab. He's a pretty handsome guy. His wife's beautiful. She's an Italian model. But anyways, handsome guy. And they have this terrible picture of him because he's been tortured for months in Cape Verde. They just brought him over to Miami in the mugshot. And then underneath the picture says in Spanish, narco traficante. And that wasn't even a charge, nor was it even mentioned in the article. So in the article, they never mentioned that his original charge was that. They mentioned the conspiracy to money laundering. So in that they were accurate. They just wanted to put it in there to taint who was ever reading the article. And of course, they completely omitted that he was tortured. But these are the so-called, journals that showed up that day. And then, of course, there was some alternative journalists like myself. And then we had the rally outside and they took our picture. And now they've been attacking me. These right-wing journalists have been saying, oh, look, he's paid by Maduro. I'm still in debt. I still have a good fund on me trying to raise money since I came back from Venice. So I'm a working class guy. I had to go in debt to go with my own money. And they're saying I'm paid by Maduro to go to Miami. I had to take a road trip to go to Miami. It's like I had to pay for my own plane ticket. What are you talking about?
As someone who actively consumes Spanish language media, I've got to ask you a question because
ask me anything you want. Also, they can ask me in the chat anything they want as well. I'm open book.
So my question is, am I imagining it when it feels like even mainstream Spanish language media has this very noticeable right-wing tilt to it?
Well, it's interesting you asked that. So when they did a poll, I believe it was 2016, and they asked Cuban Americans in Miami if they thought the Cuban embargo was working, approximately 80% of them said it was not.
Yeah, of course.
So since 2016, I guess with the propaganda and Obama's failure with Cuba, because once Biden took over, it's continued the whole Trump thing. So it's gone down from 80%. I don't know what the actual figures are now. I heard it went down despite the pandemic.
Sure.
But at least back then in 2016, when Obama had already implemented, was it December 2014 when he implemented the easing of the embargo on Cuba. So in 2016, especially because a lot of Cuban American youth that tend to be more progressive and rebel against the older generation, rebel against their parents, Up to 80% were saying that no, the embargo is not good. The embargo is not working. And so I found it impressive. And then you have these diehard right-wing Republicans, right? These Cuban guys that are ashamed to be Hispanic. Some of them even changed their last names, like from Smith, from like Suarez to Smith or whatever. Like they're known for this. They're ashamed of being Cuban. And they go around with their Trump flag and they say terrible things about Mexicans and Peruvians and other Hispanics. My father's Peruvian, but these type of right-wing Cubans, they're a minority, and they'll never vote Democrat. And they said on the radio the other day, in the Spanish radio, they were like, Biden is soft on Venezuela. Are you kidding me? And so they're so idiotic. They think that Biden and Pelosi are communists or something. Like, this is how stupid the people we're talking about. And so Biden's stupid theory, or at least his imperial excuse, because maybe he's not that stupid, and this is just the excuse that they're giving, is that, well, in the midterms, we can get the Latino vote in South Florida because I was tough on Cuba. These are a minority group of extremists of the old guard, most of them, that will never vote for you. But there's a lot of Venezuelans I know in the United States, I'm not going to say who, that like Maduro or think Maduro's but the most vocal, the minority extremists in the Latin community, including in the media, they're the ones that are maintaining this.
Yeah, no, and that and what's so hilarious about it is, you're right. It's a minority, and it's a minority of a minority. But, and this is
we're the number one demographic, though. Latinos there's more Latinos now in the United States than African Americans.
Yes. But, and this is an important but, a lot of those specific Cubans that they're worried about offending are not voters. They're not worried about losing those people's vote.
Oh, they're going to vote Republican. A lot of them are going to vote for Trump if he runs again.
What they were hoping is that some of these people wouldn't vote at all, or more importantly, wouldn't donate, because there is a huge
so part of it is so they won't give money to
donor money that goes through there. And so the most they could possibly have been hoping for in the Democratic Party is that rich Cuban donors in Miami wouldn't donate to Trump because they were mad at Trump policies, if Biden didn't sound too much like Bernie Sanders in Florida.
Well, not only that, the UN, while these Cuban protests were going on, which were largely CIA financed, the UN, it was every country in the world either abstained or voted against. The overwhelming majority, I believe 90%, voted against the Cuban embargo. Yeah. The two only countries this time that went on the record that said we're going to oppose the ending of the Cuban embargo were Israel and the United States. So right when that was happening and world public opinion was so clear, you had all these bourgeois Democrats in Miami come out and say nothing about the Cuban embargo, and say this is all the Castro regime. It's like, excuse me, Raul Castro's 90. He stepped down. They're like, this is the Castro brothers. Like, did you know Fidel died? it's like what their tweets make no sense.
Fidel died. Raul retired.
I mean, he's a socialist, but he's not a Castro. I mean, his name is Diaz-Canel. And so they don't even know the name of the current head of state of Cuba. And these Democrat, mostly white, bourgeois Democrats, to appeal to the Cuban donors, I guess, like you're saying. I don't know about Cuban donors to the Democratic Party. I mean, Manny Diaz is backed by Bloomberg, and he's head of the DNC for Florida. He's a Cuban-American right-winger. That's true. But it's not his money. It's Bloomberg's.
Well, there's a guy in Miami who works as a Democratic Party consultant and is a big Democratic donor named Fernando Mondi Jr. Now, his father, Fernando Mondi Sr., is a longtime Republican donor going back to Reagan. So you literally have the Republican guy passing the family torch to the Democratic guy whose policies are all the same as Reagan's. So the only difference is that Joe Biden is a Democrat now. But
well, it's interesting what you're saying.
Amandi Jr. is happy.
I don't know if you
Biden.
I don't know if you know this about me, but I was on the Tim Canova campaign the second time around. When he ran as an independent, I was part of the group that pushed him to go independent. And so I was part of his campaign then. And, you know, a lot of people have issues with him now. You know, he's kind of turned to the right. I'm not going to really get into that, but I can tell you back then when he was openly progressive in his campaign, he was begging for the Republicans to investigate Wasserman Schultz and to investigate Brenda Snipes, who on Wasserman Schultz orders for a second time destroyed the ballot. I was there. You know, so she's a lieutenant of the head of the Clinton mob in South Florida, who's Wasserman Schultz. And, you know, Wasserman Schultz sees me, you know, within 100 miles, like any other people sees me and there's an event there. Don't let this guy in. They know who I am. No, but the point I'm trying to make is Canova back then, when he was more like an independent progressive, was saying, you know, this is organized crime. Because when he begged in Tallahassee, the Republicans are in control. We're talking about a Democrat, Wasserman Schultz, who already had to step down as head of the DNC over the WikiLeaks, over the rigging against Bernie. I went to the DNC protest as well at the time, but he was begging the Republicans, and he had a Republican lawyer, and who was an insider, who was using his influence to try to convince the Republican governor at the time to investigate Brenda Snipes and Wasserman Schultz. Brenda Snipes eventually had to step down. She took the fall for Wasserman Schultz. She was head of the supervisor elections, very important position in Broward County in South Florida. And so finally, the lawyer told him. I don't know if you heard the story, what was going on. He said that the same Big Sugar, the same corporations, the same money that they're sending to Wasserman Schultz for her campaigns, they're sending to these Republican guys. So they're looking out for the same interests, and that's why they're not doing anything about it now. They don't see it's politically necessary.
Exactly.
So it's interesting how he decided to run as an independent and found out all these things that he wouldn't necessarily have found out if he stayed as a Democrat. Because a lot of people say, oh, he would have won if he went for a second primary. No, he went to the general elections. They rigged it against him. But I think when he ran the second time around, it really opened up things. And having part of his campaign and one of his trusted guys, I saw access to a lot of those things. And yeah, absolutely, they're taking the money from the same people.
Well, so and in addition to taking money from the same people, you literally see these generational transfers within the family, where the family politics don't change. They support all the same things their parents supported when they were Republican donors. But these people are making the same donations to Democrats for the same policy that their parents donated to Republicans to get.
I mean, Biden was pro-segregation, and Hillary was a Goldwater girl. When Bernie was being arrested in the civil rights movement, these guys were on the side of the Republicans. That's why they were put there. That's why the Clintons were put there, to push the Democratic Party to the right.
What's sad?
People don't get it.
What's sad, and I've said this before on the show, I'll probably say it again on the show, but what's sad is that Biden's first foray into politics was as an independent, volunteering for the campaign of an anti-segregationist Republican running against a Dixiecrat governor of Delaware. That was Biden's formative political experience, working on that campaign. After that campaign, he did become a Democrat because he had to be a Democrat to win the office that he was running for in his home county. But he won a position on the county board of supervisors, which is a big deal in Delaware and Maryland. We had a vice president, Spiro Agnew, who became governor of Maryland based on his performance as a county supervisor. And Biden became a senator based on his name recognition as a county supervisor. So these are, in small states, these county political jobs are a big deal. Especially
you remember how close the race was in Florida in 2000 with Gore and Bush. That's part of the reason why the former supervisor elections before Brenda Snipes also had to step down.
No.
And some of the excuses Canova was getting, I don't even know if this is actually ever revealed publicly. I can tell you now. Some of the excuses we're getting for why they want to investigate Brenda Snipes, we're going to look racist. This is what the Republicans are telling them in Tallahassee. We're going to look racist. Because every time we have supervisor election in Brown identity politics, the right wing uses it too. It's always a black woman. And you know how Canova responded? He said, "Get another black woman in there." It's like this is just excuses. He found it from his lawyers because they were being paid by the same people. But isn't that interesting? Like the right always is critical of the left for identity politics. Number one, they tell you to vote for Trump because he's not a politician. How's that not identity politics? They're doing the same thing as the liberals in that regard. They're just using it in different ways. It's like, okay, I'm going to go have an operation. I have to have a doctor who doesn't have an MD. I definitely want somebody to operate on me, but make sure they're not a doctor. I mean, that's the logic, right? They don't want anybody educated, nobody with a master's degree, nobody knows about politics. Like, and then they try to manipulate the working class by saying, "Oh, this is elitist," they want educated. It's like, no, there are people like myself who are having to go into debt to get educated. That I'm not an elite. Education is so important. I'm not saying everybody has to have a PhD in politics and enter politics, but the point is, this is the hypocrisy of the right, that they detest identity politics and then they do it themselves.
They're obsessed with it. They're obsessed with virtue signaling and everything that they say that they don't care about. I joke all the time about conservatives care way more about pronouns than any queer person.
Well,
they're spending all their time thinking about this stuff. We're not thinking about it all the time.
It's like closeted gay Republicans that are obsessed with gays and what they do, and then they turned out to be, that.
Yeah. Are there any people? I mean, but yeah, no. And it's like, where was I? I had the thought in my head. Oh no,
that's about identity politics. Yeah,
you've got they talk about elitism, but they're obsessed with their own pedigrees. All these Republican populists with their fake Southern accents went to places like Harvard and Oxford.
I went up to
John Kennedy from Louisiana.
Yeah,
one of the senators from Louisiana. He did not go to school in Oxford, Mississippi. He went to Oxford.
Oh man!
When he actually talks to people with no TV camera around, he practically sounds British, according to Joe Starwood.
The actual Oxford in Britain, wow. But it's funny because I was at a protest and I'm talking to these Southerners with their Trump flags, and I said, "Excuse me, why are you supporting a rich Yankee?" And they were taking it back. They didn't know what to say, but they're so brainwashed, that they don't realize. I don't know.
Has there ever been a bigger snowflake in politics than Trump? And yet conservatives hate snowflakes, they claim, but the biggest snowflakes
you can't
are
even make a handshake with Trudeau, right? Didn't Trudeau make him squirm? Like, he's got such little hands. Like, hey, he's a snowflake. He's supposed to be the macho. Like, come on.
He and Macron had that weird one-upsmanship with the handshake where they were trying to establish dominance.
Well, when I met Trump, he didn't permit handshakes, and he was a Democrat. He was supporting John Kerry. I had a conversation with Trump. And of course, before that, he was Reform Party. So he's all over the place. He's not a lifelong Republican by any means. He's just
he's literally a Clinton donor.
And then I heckled him later when he ran as a Republican. But yeah, back when I actually met and had a conversation with him, he was talking to me about John Kerry. I mean, and that's shocking to a lot of Trump supporters, because they don't really remember back then, or a lot of them are younger too.
He was a Democratic Party donor.
Ben's his wedding guest at Melania's when he married Melania.
He donated to people like the Clintons and Chuck Schumer and Kristen Gillibrand and Andrew Cuomo.
Yeah, and also, although many of the quotes have been exaggerated, there are several interviews where he says, if you want to fool people, run as a Republican, basically. If you want an easy ticket to just tricking people into giving you power, run as a Republican.
Well, he's on the record
like this back in the 80s.
He's on the record, Kennedy, for actually saying also is that don't tell me I lost my train of thought. This happens sometimes.
Trump is on the record as saying.
I know I said that, but.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's all right. Yes. When he was with the Reform Party, he was on the record saying that he had to leave the party because David Duke was joining.
Yes.
Isn't that ironic, right? Because he didn't want to talk about
David
Duke guys or the Proud Boys. And then later, when David Duke endorsed him when he ran as a Republican, he said, "Who's that? Who's that? You went on the record and said you left the Reform Party. You were outraged that they brought David Duke in."
He's also on the record as saying that he's really pro-choice. I mean, literally, that he didn't just say he was pro-choice. He said, "I'm really pro-choice."
Yeah.
He has in the past been on the record, despite including slurs in the same comments. He has in the past been on the record supporting gay rights.
Well, the Republicans for a long time were pro-choice because they saw that as a government meddling.
Yes.
And then they figured out, wait a minute, we can get the Christian right on our side in the South. And then they pretended to be pro-life.
Well, and so it's
which is a stupid term, right? Because you're pro-death and everything else on war and all that, but you're pro-life on birth, I guess.
Barry Goldwater, who someone actually called the other day on MSNBC the Strom Thurmond of Arizona, which is, I mean, you can say a lot of things fairly to criticize Barry Goldwater about, but comparing him to Strom Thurmond is a little much when he was the commandant of the Arizona Air National Guard. He not only integrated it, but made it, but allowed black people to be officers before they could be officers in the U.S. Air Force. So, I mean, Barry Goldwater had all sorts of problems, but, comparing him to Strom Thurmond is a little much. But
it's just a revisionist history. They're mythologizing, like how they mythologize King, and they try to make him look like a liberal moderate. When he literally came out and said that he was against the moderates, he said that, it seems to me they're even worse now than the Ku Klux Klan. How they're saying to wait.
That's because they aren't moderates anymore. I mean, this is one of the biggest things to change is that when Martin Luther King said that, a moderate was actually somewhere between these really liberal New Deal Democrats and Rockefeller Republicans.
I agree. Liberal centrists are basically moderates, right? Because I hear liberal, I'm not a liberal, I'm a socialist. So I agree with you. But when he was
but when we talk about centrists now,
mm-hmm.
because of the way everything has shifted and how far right Clinton was, when we talk about centrists now, we're talking about right wingers already.
Yeah, center right at least. Yeah.
We're talking about the right versus the far right. When we're just talking about Democrats.
Oh yeah. If you're talking about like certain Democrats or like the Bushes versus the Trump, that's center right versus far right. That's correct.
Yeah, they're not actually moderate. They're pretty conservative. They're just not Trump.
Well, there was this woman that came from my undergrad when I used to go to FAU. I forget her name. She's from Central America. She's a conservative. She's anti-Trump. And so they were bringing her out as this hero, against Trump. And I'm like, this woman's conservative. I'm going to do a Q&A and reveal her hypocrisy. So I asked her one question, and her answer was like really bad. I think I did a good job in exposing her just with her answer. And I said, what's worse, a phone call or because this is during the impeachment. So I said, what's worse? The first impeachment, by the way, a phone call or putting children in concentration camps. And she tried to say it was the equivalency. It was the same thing. And I'm like, wow, this is like when Trump, I didn't say this like in the microphone, but I said afterwards, I'm like, wow, this is like when Trump said that, that Antifa and the alt-right were one and the same kind of thing. It's like, no, number one, Trump was trying to stop neo-Nazis from getting weapons. That's literally what happened. I mean, I'm not defending Trump. I'm just saying what happened. I mean, the U.S. Under the Democrats had a tradition of backing neo-Nazis in Ukraine. I mentioned it earlier. Trump wanted to put a stop to that, not to be a good guy, but just to show he was different than Democrats. I don't know. And so he did what, dozens of U.S. presidents have done is make a threat. We're an empire. U.S. presidents make calls to other heads of state, make threats all the time into our history. And so he was saying, if you don't do this, then I'm going to stop sending weapons to your neo-Nazi brigades. And that was a bigger reason to impeach them, putting children in cages and in concentration camps.
Well, the whole thing, and it's just so awful to me, but the whole thing about Trump and Russia and the Ukraine. So if you want to talk about the facts, Trump has connections to all sorts of Russian gangsters who want to launder money in the U.S. That's
Absolutely.
what the real estate industry. That's what the real estate industry in the U.S. is, a money laundering enterprise for Saudis and Russians.
Chris, those are the Russians that were exiled by Putin, right? So when people tried to use the fact that Trump was consorting with Putin's enemies in the Russian mob in exile to say, oh, that proves that he's an agent for Putin, I said that's like Trump going to Cayo Ocho in Miami and meeting with Cuban exiles and say, oh, now we know he was an agent of Fidel Castro.
There's one of the first big lies of Russiagate. Well, all the Russian mafia people answer to Putin now.
Not true.
Yep. The Russian mafia hates the Russian state and spits all over cops and police and
that's not a defense of Putin. That's just a fact. You know, these are the guys that were thrown out of Russia. These were a lot of the oligarchs that Putin didn't like after the Soviet Union fell.
These are people whose bosses of bosses are usually in prison still because the democratic Russians and the communist Russians and Putin's fascist Russians, none of them would let them out of prison because it wasn't about politics. It was about the fact that they were actually, serious gangsters, serious high-level gangsters who will probably never be let out of prison. Yes, baby, I will try.
And so that's the level of how people are so manipulated and they don't do their homework, right? And it's just sound bites. They're like, the moment they hear that, oh, he had real estate dealings with Russian mobsters, it's like, well, then of course he had to have been working for Putin.
Yeah, but he liked Putin and admired Putin. This was all publicly on the record. And he was generally seen as someone who wanted to make the U.S.'s relationship with Russia better.
Well, that's because
so they
isolationist, right?
It was because of the isolationist, and also because he understood some of the complaints that Russians make in a way that people in the U.S. don't hear those things. I sound like I'm defending Trump. I don't want to defend Trump.
But you know that I debated. I challenged Vouch to a debate recently. He responded to me. Because I was going to present the, I think that China and Russia's influence in the world is better. I wasn't going to defend the Russian and Chinese government. I was going to say that their influence is better because they're bringing vaccines, they're doing humanitarian things. In comparison to the U.S. empire, virtually anything's better. And so I challenged them to a debate, and I showed them the debate I did with Caleb Maupin. Because Caleb Maupin had debated Vouch once. I thought Vouch was very unfair with Caleb. He called him a Nazi and all that. But it's like I could take blows. So I challenged him to a debate. He responded. He said, "Do you want to go on tonight?" And it was a setup because he literally let me know like an hour before the show. Of course, I didn't see the email in time, and so that was like 2 weeks ago. And so I've emailed him so many times. He ignores me now. So for some reason, he doesn't want to debate me. But that would be an interesting debate, right? If I could take down Vouch on that.
So all I can say is, number one, Caleb Maupin is a Nazi, but he's still a better class of Nazi than Vouch, if such a thing is possible. But
Caleb and I got our differences, but I would call him a closeted Stalinist, right? Because he will never say that he's a Stalinist, but he uses all the same rhetoric as a lot of the Stalinists.
So I mean, and the thing that worries me is that some of the things that, and this is just the difference perhaps between mindsets, but Stalin, I don't remember Stalin ever talking about Cossacks not being Russian or some of the weird stuff but some of the stuff I really want to blame on him is actually said by people who support him and he sometimes supports. So it's hard to.
Well, I'll tell you this: the economic system that was put in place under Stalin is identical to what the economic system would have been under Lenin and Trotsky.
No,
that's why I take heat from the hardcore Stalinists, and I take heat from the Orthodox Trotskyists, both. When I say that, but it's true. My differences with Stalinism are political. Because he did not permit a workers' democracy to come about, which I believe Lenin and Trotsky were trying to do. There was emergency measures, civil war, invasion. But yeah, that's
main differences were not economic. That's right. The main differences were were political and what I would call class, in the sense that Lenin was a sort of bottom level of the aristocracy kind of guy.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because people exaggerate. They say, "Oh, Lenin and Trotsky were part of the aristocracy." No, their families were upper middle class. Well, so they were bourgeois, maybe a little more than bourgeois, but yeah.
Lenin's family had a title, and it sounds more impressive than it is, but it also really was a blood title that was handed down.
He was also part Jewish, and because of the history of the pogroms, they looked down on Lenin.
Lenin was the title translated into English as hereditary nobleman.
I didn't know that.
And he inherited that title because one of his ancestors was a merchant who did a favor for Peter the Great, and was one of the first people rewarded with Peter the Great's new title, hereditary nobleman, which was invented as a way to create social mobility and a middle class.
Interesting.
And by the time that a real middle class started to develop, a sort of a Russian bourgeois, the hereditary nobleman was sort of the bottom level of the upper aristocratic class, as opposed to the top level of the middle bourgeois.
Chris, let's be honest here. In order to have access to Marxist literature, in order to be literate in Tsarist Russia, you had to have been middle class.
Pretty much, yeah.
And so Stalin was a bandit. He was robbing banks for the Bolsheviks.
Yes.
I think Stalin was pretty much semi-literate. So he was not intellectual. He wasn't like Leonard Trotsky.
He studied to be a priest, and you had to learn to read and write to be a priest in the Russian church.
Okay, well, I'll put it this way: he wasn't an intellectual, and most of what he did was, and he was brave. I'm not gonna say he wasn't brave. He robbed banks. I mean, that's you have to be brave to rob banks. He was kind of seen as like the hard guy, the bandit they were going to go send. Well,
he was,
and then he got himself into politics later. But yeah,
this is where it's weird. Stalin was Lenin's contact to hard guys. The guy who did the bank robbing was actually possibly one of the first people that Stalin murdered. He was
want to take credit for the whole stuff.
He was in a suspicious bicycle accident.
Really?
Yes.
Was that in Georgia?
No, he retired to Moscow or Leningrad. I can't remember which, and he was hit by a bike. He rode the bike every day.
Wait, he was hit by a bus on the bike?
Riding the bike.
He was hit by a car on the bike. Okay.
He was hit by a car while riding the bike. But it was very suspicious. And some people, especially people who want to make Stalin look bad, do like to blame that on Stalin.
Well, I'll tell you this: I'm not going to say he was dumb. I said he wasn't intellectual, but he had street smarts, and he had to have been a little Machiavellian to be underestimated by everybody and still get to the top.
He was intellectual enough that he did write some real theory, and it's not totally crap.
Well, he was basing it on others, but yes, like the main debate with Trotsky was permanent revolution versus socialism in one state, and socialism in one state clearly didn't work. But socialism in one state was a part of Marxism, I believe, that they misinterpreted. That was from other people that were intellectuals.
Socialism
that he used to do that debate with Trotsky.
This is Stalinist innovation in order to try to ease tensions with the West, as part of a general plan to try to make nice with the UK and the US.
Well, also what he did in China, right? He backed Shanghai Shek against Mao.
Yes.
He backed the bourgeois, and Shanghai Shek, killed thousands of communists in China. So it happened in Spain, it happened in Western Europe, and it also in China. It was a disastrous policy every time they implemented it.
The Popular Front.
Right, rather than the United Front. The Popular Front, I mean, the uniting with the bourgeois. But I'm not going to say that Trotsky was against uniting with the bourgeois in every scenario. For example, he was one of the few on the left that was saying that the Social Democrats, who he despised, he loved Rosa Luxemburg. They were comrades. They knew each other.
Yeah.
He despised the Social Democrats because they were in power when they assassinated Rosa Luxemburg. They helped get those military units in there. Those right-wing military units made a deal with them to crush Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg and the Spartacus League. So Trotsky wasn't saying this because he liked the Social Democrats. He was saying it out of political necessity. He said that the Social Democrats in the Reichstag in Germany should work with the Communist Party to prevent the Nazis from taking over. The Nazis don't have the support of the working class.
And the Social Democrats.
But Stalin ordered the Communist Party not to work with the Social Democrats, even for a parliamentary thing to prevent the rise of the Nazis. And the rest is history.
It's a little more complicated. So Ernest Thälmann, who was the leader of the Communist Party in Germany at the time, actually had a bigger and better reputation in the in the communist movement internationally than Stalin did.
Interesting.
Stalin was considered by many people the leader of European communism because the German Communist Party was the most successful communist party anywhere outside of Russia before World War II.
And that's the homeland of Marx,
yeah. And Thälmann was seen as someone with a great deal of experience and gravitas, and was someone that the USSR should listen to. And Thälmann's position, which Stalin later renounced, and which I think that Thälmann had some points, but that's a whole other debate. Stalin's position was that the Social Democrats were social fascists.
Yes, which is stupid.
Well, no, hear me out.
Yeah.
Because, not only because of their history, but because their Popular Front organization, the Iron League, specifically targeted both the Nazis and the communists, not just the Nazis. It's very important to understand that the
What was his position?
What was Thälmann's position, or the Social Democrats' position?
What was Thälmann's position then? Yeah.
Thälmann's position was that the Social Democrats were social fascists.
Okay, he thought the same.
That communists should not work with them because they could not be trusted.
So why did Stalin then renounce his position if they were in agreement?
Because he became one of the people who believed the revisionist account post-war of what happened in 1932 and 1933.
So he thought he was wrong?
He thought that Thälmann was wrong.
No. What I mean is Thälmann thought himself was wrong later. He admitted that
Thälmann died. Thälmann didn't have a chance to admit anything. Okay. Thälmann was one of the first people killed by Hitler.
Okay, that's very sad. Yeah.
He was arrested almost as soon as Hitler had the power to arrest anybody. He was one of the first people sent to camp,
go into exile.
First shipments, and he died very soon thereafter.
Terrible. I got to look that guy up. It's very interesting.
But the Social Democrats formed what they called the Iron Front in 1932 with the intention of winning the 1932 presidential election. The Iron Front was an alliance between the Social Democrats and all their associated and allied labor union parties and left parties that weren't actually communist, and the German Workers' Party, which was extremely right-wing and was the party of the incumbent president. Sorry, not the German Workers' Party, the German National People's Party. The German Workers' Party became the Nazis later. It's hard to keep all the
they called the Socialist Workers' Party. Yeah.
It's hard to keep all the right-wing German parties.
Right, National Socialists were right-wing, which was a form of fascism. Yeah.
Well, the German Workers' Party was right-wing, but they called themselves a Workers' Party anyway, and then they became...
Yeah, and it didn't really convince a lot of the working class to support them, though. It was mostly middle-class support that they got merchants. But here's what I think should happen. I didn't know about that individual, but I think, real quick, that diplomacy should have prevailed. What I mean by diplomacy is that there should have been talks, there should have been dialogue between the different opposition groups.
There was,
so that they could reach a deal. What I mean is so that they could reach a deal in Parliament to do like a block against the Nazis.
Yeah, sadly,
that never happened. Instead, they attacked them as social fascists and they didn't unite.
No. Sadly, that wasn't the kind of dealing that was going on. Right. The kind of dealing that was going on was that after Hindenburg was elected president, and that election was very good for the Nazis very good for the Social Democrats, okay for the communists, and not very good for Hindenburg's party. And so what happened was Hindenburg won the presidency based mostly on all these centrist and left-wing votes. And then he named a chancellor from his own party, the German National People's Party, which was extremely right-wing. Mm-hmm. And the chancellor the chancellor Hindenburg chose was literally in talks with Gregor Strasser of the Nazis mm-hmm. to try to make a deal with the Strasserite wing of the Nazi party to make him dictator instead of Hitler.
Well, also by calling them social fascists, they were literally almost like throwing them into the arms of the Nazis. So I know there was deals between the Nazis and the social, in Hindenburg. But what I mean is that there should have been, dialogue between the opposition against the Nazis.
The trouble was that first the Iron Front had been formed. The Social Democrats were already in alliance with the German People's Party at this point. And along with the German People's Party came a bunch of little parties, the Berlin People's Party, the Hamburg People's Party, all these connected state level and city level parties. And so it was a right-wing alliance against both fascists and communists in the first place. The Iron League was a cross front between the social democratic wing of the left, the actual parties that called themselves centrist, most importantly the Catholic Center, which was the ancestor of later Christian democratic parties in Germany, mm-hmm. and the People's Parties, which were very much at right wing, as right wing as the
Catholic Center. Themselves. The Catholic Center Party had a history of persecution against the Catholics by the Protestant majority in Germany, and a lot of them were not right wingers. They were sympathetic when it came to people that were being persecuted. And they were centrist. Yeah,
they were sympathetic to some things because they had been persecuted, but they were also, the simple fact is the Catholic Church of the 1930s was very anti-Semitic.
Not only that, in the 1940s, because in the 1940s, through the rat lines, the CIA and the Vatican brought, this is why the Condor years emerged, right? They brought these Nazis that were wanted,
Paperclip.
They were wanted by the West. They brought not just Operation Paperclip, they brought them to South America, not just to NASA. These weren't just scientists; they were war criminals.
Odessa.
And they became, advisors of the fascist juntas down there. But yes, the Vatican was complicit in that with the CIA that was recently emerged to get these Nazis out.
Yeah, and so, but anyway. There was an agreement made between sections of the left and sections of the right to keep both the communists and the Nazis out of the presidency, and they also hoped to keep both of them from making major gains in the parliament.
So do you think the Reichstag flag was a false flag that they didn't expect to happen, that the Nazis used so that they could have the enabling act and get
the Reichstag fire is pretty much established as having been probably set by Nazi supporters,
right? Which would have been a false flag.
Yes.
In Gulf of Tonkin, we have our history of false flags too, right?
But anyway, where I was getting is that the Iron League was pretty much a right-wing deal in the first place. And the argument that this was necessary to stop Hitler and that whatever came of this would be better than Hitler starts to fall apart when you look at the fact that Hindenburg's chancellor was trying to get Social Democrat support and Strasserist support to have himself declared dictator so that he could stay chancellor and they wouldn't have to appoint Hitler. So somebody else already wanted to be a military dictator.
Right, but did they want to start World War II? Did they want to do all the things Hitler wanted to do? You know?
Yes. This is very important to understand, too. Everything, foreign policy-wise, that Hitler did had been aggressively pursued under Klaus Ebert's presidency. Not Klaus Ebert, sorry. Under, now I've got to look him up again.
Yeah, but the point I'm trying to make is that Hitler convinced his cabinet to back his moves in Czechoslovakia and elsewhere by telling them that the British are not going to intervene. The Americans are not going to intervene.
And there was reason for people
didn't want a second World War. Even the most staunch Nazis, Hitler deceived them because he wanted it.
But, and this is important, Friedrich Ebert, who was the first president of Weimar Germany, already wanted to build up the German military and created as president the Freikorps, which was an auxiliary military made up of veterans who eventually became the Nazis, essentially.
Well, the Freikorps are the ones that in the 1920s assassinated Rosa and Karl.
They assassinated Rosa and Karl in 1919, and then they tried to take over the country in 1920.
Right.
And then their former members became the basis for both the German People's Party and the German Workers' Party.
But let me ask you, if any other military dictator would have had the same foreign policy of Hitler, then why did Hitler have to deceive his own cabinet members on the record?
Because anybody else would have had to play some sort of game like that to start a war. And when you start to get into the World War II stuff, it starts to get speculative. Could somebody else have played the game as well? But two things.
But Hitler wanted to work with the British against the Soviet Union.
Both Hitler and the other guy agreed on is they wanted to be dictator.
Right.
And ultimately they wanted a war with the Soviet Union.
Yep.
And also
the pact between Hitler and Stalin was a temporary pact because it was inevitable they were gonna go to war.
And so Friedrich Ebert and Hindenburg and Hitler all had essentially the same foreign policy. The difference was Hitler accelerated it. You can make a case that a different dictator would have also accelerated it for the same reasons as Hitler. Now he was dictator and he could. It's also important to remember that Hitler's rival, who almost would have been dictator, was also a general and would have had more support from the military itself than Hitler did had he become dictator.
And Stalin took out, all the head of the Red Guard. He was paranoid that they were Trotskyists. He left Russia vulnerable. He underestimated Hitler. He ignored warnings. There was actually a film partially about this. It's very interesting. It's called Stalin's James Bond. And it's a true story. It's about a spy in Japan who was half German, half Russian. He was working for Stalin. Yeah. And he warned, he was getting intelligence from the Germans. And these warnings that he would, send to Stalin were ignored. And then when he warned about how the Japanese were not going to attack, Stalin took him seriously. That saved the Soviet Union because that brought in all the Eastern forces to defend Moscow. Did they give him, a medal for it? No, they sent his wife to a gulag and he was captured by the Japanese and Stalin let him die. Very sad. Yep. Yep. But the guy helped change the course of the war was the spy, and there was many others besides him that warned Stalin, especially in the early days that the Nazis were advancing, and Stalin ignored these warnings.
To be fair, to give Stalin credit, before the temporary deal with Hitler, Stalin's foreign minister had been Maxim Litvinov, who had a British wife and was very pro-British and pro-American, and was working very hard to try to build an anti-fascist alliance between the USSR, France, and Great Britain.
But he wasn't the one that actually did the deal with Molotov, right? That was
the problem is that Molotov was Litvinov's replacement because the French didn't want anything to do with Stalin. They kind of wanted to see if they could make alliances with Hitler against Stalin.
You talking about the British wanted to work with Hitler?
The British and the French both saw Hitler as preferable to communists, and they thought that Hitler was the best thing for them.
I would say that's definitely the case of the United States, who was neutral during all of this until Pearl Harbor, and when Germany declared war on the United States. But I don't really see the evidence for the British on that, because when Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia and the British tried to appease him, then they let it go. But then when Hitler invaded Poland, or at least portions of Poland, as part of his deal with Stalin, then they declared war.
Well, so they reached the point. They didn't want to go to war any more than the German army did. Mm-hmm. And there were different factions, because you have to remember that there were 3 prime ministers leading up into all that. You had Stanley Baldwin, and then you had,
who's the name of the appeaser?
Well, Stanley Baldwin was the appeaser. Neville Chamberlain.
But there was a guy after him.
Neville Chamberlain gets blamed for being the appeaser. But Neville Chamberlain was actually elected and beat Stanley Baldwin on the promise to get tough on the Nazis.
That's interesting.
and he won because Churchill defected from the Tories to Neville Chamberlain's party, which was the Liberals at the time.
Well, both Chamberlain and Churchill were conservative, right? Conservative Party members, right?
At different times, and they both changed for different reasons.
Right.
And Churchill defected to the Liberal Party and helped Chamberlain beat Stanley Baldwin. But then he went back to the Conservative Party and beat Neville Chamberlain because of the no confidence vote that followed the invasion of Poland. Because Neville Chamberlain believed he had been very tough on Hitler in Munich, and they had been very clear about saying, all right, this is a fair claim, but you can't take anything beyond the fair claim. And if you take anything beyond the fair claim, there's going to be a war.
Kennedy wrote in the chat that he's going to be back just in case. By the way, do you actually see people on your end in the chat if they have questions or anything like that?
I do. And so far we haven't had any questions.
Okay, not yet.
We've had some comments. This one is still good.
There's been, like, for example, a cyber war going on.
This was when we were talking about authoritarianism.
Totally, yeah, that's right. Only the rich have rights. I was saying that as well. I said in the courts you're going to get a high sentence unless you're rich, right?
Yeah.
Then you can afford a good lawyer. But anyways, there's a cyber war that's been going on in WikiLeaks. Like, there's so much false information about people like Alex Saab. For example, there was claims that his wife, Camille Fabry, was living in Russia. Like, while I'm with her in Venezuela, she clearly lives in Venezuela with their children. And it's like, according to Wikipedia, her residence was Russia. They were just trying to use the whole Russia menace thing to make Alex Saab look bad through his wife. Oh yeah, something else that's ridiculous about his case. I can get into a lot of details there. Like, his son had turned 18. His son's not political at all. But for being his blood, they sanctioned Alex Saab's son as soon as he turned 18. I mean, this is the ridiculous of the sanctions. Like, they use sanctions once against Maduro's wife, who's not political at all either. It's just economic terrorism. A lot of people think of it as just like closing a bank account that they have abroad. No, it's suffocating a population. It's trying to cut off their food, trying to cut off their medicines, whether they're cancer patients and that's why, in spite of having help from Russia and China and other nations and having a social system of healthcare, Venezuela has lost in the past few years from Trump and Biden sanctions 100,000 people. That's very significant.
This is where it's important to be really clear about the kind of system that we're trying to kill in Venezuela. Because people in both parties, doesn't matter whether they're Republicans or Democrats, they will tell you that Venezuela is a socialist or even a communist country. When the fact is that Hugo Chavez was trying heroically to turn Venezuela into a Nordic social democracy. They put all their oil money into a social wealth fund, and they started using that to make people's lives better. They didn't use the now radicalized military to throw conservatives out of the government. They didn't take political action against political enemies. The only people they arrested were people who had actually committed crimes under the previous government.
Well, let me ask you, do you know where Barinas is in Venezuela? Have you heard of that town, Barinas?
No, you'll have to tell me more.
So Barinas, ever since 1998, has been under control of the Chavistas, and it literally is the hometown of Hugo Chavez.
Yes.
He has several siblings that still live there. He had a brother who was governor of that state.
Yeah.
So just recently in Barinas, this month, there was a revote of sorts.
Yes.
So the independent organization electoral commission that looks into their regional elections, this time was for governor, mayorships, and municipalities.
Yeah.
They said, okay, these two opposition candidates plus the Chavista who ran, which was Chavez's brother. This was in November last year. I was one of the people who observed those elections. There was a technicality, and they threw out the race. So they said the opposition is going to have to find new candidates. The Chavistas is going to have to find new candidates.
Mm-hmm.
The Chavistas found a very popular candidate who used to be the number 3 in the government. He used to be Chavez's son-in-law, actually. He's the father of his child, of his grandson. His name Jorge Arriaza. He speaks English very well. Great guy. So Jorge Arriaza, who was the foreign minister, number 3 in the government, very popular Chavista, went to Barinas and campaigned as the Chavista candidate against the 2 right-wing opposition candidates they had for governor there. Okay. And the campaign just ended about a week ago, and the results came in. And guess what? Arriaza only got 41% of the vote. There's a center-right candidate who beat him by like 15 points, and the third candidate got very little. So, yes, it's true. Out of 24 regions, 20 of them belong to the ruling party, the Chavistas, the United Socialist Party. But if this was a dictatorship,
why would they let the other party win an election?
The hometown of Chavez to let the opposition win. Are you kidding me? And now the opposition recognizes it, right? Whenever they win, then all of a sudden it's not a dictatorship anymore. This is the absurdity of it. And Guaido never ran for president. He's considered a traitor by the Venezuelan people. And Biden still, just like under Trump, is saying he's the president. It's absurd.
Guaido
he was party months ago.
He's not even in the National Assembly anymore. He lost re-election. His party got thrown out.
Yes. Well, there was a new guy in his party that remained in the assembly. Then they were thrown out altogether. But he was thrown out of his party more than months ago. He threw out of his party like a year ago already. It's called, ironically, the Popular Will Party, Voluntad Popular.
Yes.
But they're a very small far-right party. And, guy never ran for president. He wasn't known to the Venezuelan people before the scandal. And it's like, he can't show his face in Venezuela. They detest him. The opposition hates him. And Biden still says he's president. When the opposition just won 4 regions in these elections.
What's depressing about that party is they started out, and this is how you can't trust anything associated with the U.S. government, even when it looks good. They started out as one of these sort of anti-communist democratic socialist parties that was being supported by the CIA because they were anti-communist, but they were still considered left of everybody else in the country. But now they sound as right-wing as anybody else.
Well, even some opposition members in Venezuela have to call themselves socialists to get elected because the populace is so far to the left. And that's because they've been educated and they see how better life is, having had a leftist president like Chavez. And Maduro, although I admit does not have the charisma that Chavez had, the majority of the population are backing him, especially when you have regions where there's multiple candidates and there's only one from the United Socialist Party. Mathematically, the odds are for the socialists as well. Yep. So to call all of this dictatorship when Biden never sent a single official from the United States to observe these elections, there was Americans there, including not just myself, those people from the Carter Center, but they weren't sent by Biden. And then Biden's
Carter Center said it was
secretary said there was irregularities. And the Carter Center didn't say that, and they never provided evidence of the irregularities. They never said what the irregularities were, but all the countries, including the EU, that observed it, that witnessed the elections, had said that they were democratic.
The Carter Center said that the election was legit, and Jimmy Carter says the U.S. is an oligarchy and not a democracy. So if you go by those two right there, then according to the Carter Center and its founder, Venezuela is more democratic than the U.S.
You know, it's funny. Jimmy Carter has the same birthday as me, and it's also the Independence Day of China, October 1st. Yeah, October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong. But yeah, it's an interesting coincidence.
Now, the only interesting coincidence like that I have is that Sterling K. Brown from This Is Us is exactly 1 year older than me. Same day, same month.
Oh, you know what's also crazy? These two gentlemen here, they're the same age. Did you know that? Assange and Saab are both 50 now. Yeah. They were both born 1971.
Yeah. Yeah, no, Sterling K. Brown, same birthday, but just the year before me. So he's exactly 1 year older than me to the day.
Yeah, isn't that crazy when you find out those things? It's like there has to be a numerological explanation or something.
Well, the cooler part than that, at least I think it's cooler, is I also share a birthday with Gregory Peck and Spencer Tracy.
Cool.
I would brag about that more, but the This Is Us is the one that people would probably recognize now. but yeah, no, and Assange and Saab, I mean,
they come from different cultures, but they come from the same generation and the same plight. One to fight for diplomacy against economic terrorism, the other to fight for investigative journalism, for publishing, for truth, for transparency. And there's a lot of similarities between the two cases that are brought up. Oh yeah, for example, are you familiar with the Spanish jurist Baltasar Garzón?
No, I'm not, but tell me
so
more.
You remember, well, it was a while ago, but you heard historically, because you're well-versed in history, about when they first brought an arrest warrant, international arrest warrant against Pinochet when he was in Britain.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Protected by Thatcher. Yeah, the guy who made that possible on behalf of the Chilean exiles in Spain was Garzón. So he's very prestigious. When I lived in Spain for a time, he was going after a mayor there in the town that I lived in. Like, he has gone after corruption. He's fearless. He's very respected in the international community, and he's represented Assange for years. I think when the show first started, I mentioned that I had told Julian Assange's brother and father about Alex Saab. I literally was the first person to tell them about him. How do I know? I went up to them, and after speaking with them for a few minutes, they were, in the tour. The first stop was in Miami, collecting funds and getting support for Julian. But I said to them, "Have you heard of Alex Saab?" And they both told me no. And so I literally was the first person to tell them about him. And of course, then they heard about him from other people in the panel and all that. But it's interesting because like a month later in Washington, Max Blumenthal's wife, Anya Parampil, did an interview. I know all these people. So Anya did an interview with Gabriel Shipton, Julian's brother, very brave man as well. His younger brother, and he mentioned Alex Saab in the interview. And then all of a sudden, a couple of weeks passed, and Garzón offered to be Alex Saab's lawyer. So you could say I was one of the people that helped put that in motion, make all the connections there. So one person being in the right place at the right time can be part of history,
Now, here we do have a question.
Okay.
Which country has the best government in Latin America?
I would say Bolivia, and that's not because, their government's necessarily like superior to the Venezuelan. It's just that Bolivia has more results because they don't have sanctions on them. And also the contrast is quite clear, right? You just had Áñez, who was arrested, who's the former fascist dictator backed by the United States.
Yeah.
A lot of people are upset that Guaido's not behind bars, but they actually brought these fascists to justice in Bolivia. There's only two governments in the world that makes Mother Nature protected by law, which is part of eco-socialism. That's Venezuela and Bolivia.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to say that they're dissimilar. They're very similar with one another. They're both socialist governments. They both emerged around the same time, under Morales and Chavez. But Bolivia has done incredible economic miracles, and they're back on their feet again since Áñez was thrown out. So Bolivia is a great example. And that's the country where Che Guevara died, my hero. That's his direct legacy.
Bolivia is a good example. Evo Morales is a little bit, in my opinion, to the left of Chavez and Maduro, and his reforms have been, especially when it comes to land, have been a little more not socialist enough to necessarily satisfy the communists in his country. I had the interesting experience of making friends with a Latin American communist who could explain what Latin American communists criticized about Evo. But that aside, his land reform was very left wing.
Well, also think about the demographics, the demographical differences between Bolivia and Venezuela. It's important to understand that 65% of the population of Bolivia is indigenous.
And that
Evo Morales was their first indigenous head of state. And also there's a lot more farmland in Bolivia than in Venezuela. So when you have farmland indigenous leaders working with their fellow indigenous leftists, it facilitates it. It makes it easier. So it's not like Chavez wanted to be less left than Evo Morales. It was what was demographically possible.
Again, and revolutionary socialists would say, and this is, of course, the exact opposite of what the U.S. government would say, so I understand why Chavez maybe didn't do it. But revolutionary socialists would say that at any time he wanted to, Chavez could have used his radicalized and revolutionized military to actually take over the country and actually start building a socialist.
There's a lot of divisions within the Venezuelan military, even to this day.
I understand.
To people about that.
And this is
in 2002, the military almost killed Chavez at the orders of Washington.
And obviously, that would have been a much bigger risk of actual invasion, if not necessarily by the U.S. itself, than by neighbors.
I'll ask you this: Have you heard of Cabello? He's the head of the Venezuelan Congress. You heard of Cabello, right?
Yeah.
So Cabello, like, literally was the guy that they were going to make president in the 90s when Chavez had done the revolutionary attempt back then. And then he became a political prisoner, and then he was released in an amnesty, and then ran and started a new party, a coalition party. And so Cabello, who's a pretty important Chavista, he's still around. He's head of the Congress. A lot of people ask, why Maduro? Why not Cabello? Why is it when Chavez died, before he died, he said that he wanted Maduro as vice president to become president? By the way, there was elections. Yeah. What happened when Kennedy was killed? Was Johnson elected? No. So they're very democratic in those ways, even when there's there's a death of a head of state. But anyways, the reason why is because Cabello is a military guy, and there's a lot of divisions in the military, and they didn't want there to be a coup, so they wanted to use a civilian, and that's why they used Maduro. And that was 2013. That's when Chavez died, not that far back. So in 2002, though, in the beginning, before Chavez was openly socialist, he just presented himself as a progressive nationalist. Yeah. He became a socialist integrationist and wanted to unite South America against the U.S. empire. That was as a result of the 2002 coup attempt, where the Venezuelan military kidnapped Chavez, put him on a helicopter, sent him to an island.
The U.S. literally taking off all that socialist rhetoric.
But it's important to understand how dramatic this was. This is what actually happened. He was literally taking off his valuables, getting ready to die. They had the firing squad ready. All of a sudden, they got a phone call. There's 1 million people at the presidential palace demanding Chavez's return. And then Chavez's allies in the military intervened. His squad, his helicopter squad, because he was part of the helicopter squad when he was a veteran, he was a soldier. Yeah. So they came to the island, and said, "Hey, there's these 1 million people here. They're ready to tear to shreds the puppet government we have there." So that forced them to return Chavez to the palace, and then he became more openly socialist. But it's interesting because when I was in Venezuela, I went to the burial site of the great Liberator Boulevard, and of course also the burial site of Comandante, or the Commandant Chavez himself. And so when I went to see where Chavez is buried, I was overlooking the presidential palace. It was like a dream. I always wanted to go to Venezuela. And I'm talking to this Venezuelan woman, and I said, "So where were you then in 2002? She says, "I was there with those 1 million people." And I was like, wow. But that's democracy in action. The people would not be fooled. They wouldn't believe the lies against Chavez. And Chavez came back, and he was braver than ever. He said, "If they're going to try to kill me again, I'm going to fulfill this revolution." Then,
we can't manage to do anything like that here.
It is hard to mobilize people when so many people are aware that the two corporate parties are completely bought off by the elites. We desperately need third party. We desperately need laws to make more access to third parties. We need a revolutionary movement. We can't just rely on electoralism. Although rig it, like what happened with Canova and countless others, or with Bernie.
But that's the whole thing, is that the point of a revolutionary movement, to a certain extent, is not to win elections, though I'm not complaining if we do, but to show people that, you're not going to actually settle this with elections.
Absolutely. And you have to build your own media, like we're trying to do. You know, I have a little show called Vanguard Youth Radio. You know, you have your podcast. Uncivil Disobedience, and it's a good name, by the way. But yeah, I mean, the time for being civil is over. We need to form a revolutionary movement through alternative media, through protests, through pressure groups. Yes. We cannot just rely on electoralism. There's a lot we can learn of how the left united in Latin America. That's one of the things I was learning when I was down in Venezuela. So let's hope, the truth gets out, that more and more people on the left understand the importance of the Assange case, because a lot of people in the United States that support Assange are Republicans, unfortunately. We need a lot more independent leftists and progressives to get behind Assange and understand that the lies against him are defamation, and to get behind the diplomatic efforts of Alex Saab and the importance of his freedom and his vindication.
We need to be defending the rights of journalists to tell the truth and the rights of diplomats to not be arrested or tortured. I mean, what other country in the world arrests and tortures diplomats?
It's insane. When's
the last time you heard of the Chinese or the Iranians?
Even during World War II, we never captured any German diplomats. We respected their immunity. Yeah. So there was accords before the Vienna Convention to protect diplomats as well. This is the lawlessness of not just Trump now, but Biden, which proves that the U.S. continues to act in the same manner when it's as it is as an empire with so many bases throughout the world.
The Nuremberg trials, for all the I hate it when I can't talk. For all the fanfare the Nuremberg trials got, the Nuremberg trials are the only time in history that the winners of a war punished the losers for war crimes.
That's interesting, right? Because when World War I ended, how they punished them was through reparations.
But it wasn't all the usual diplomatic, and it was an unequal treaty. It was unfair. They stripped all these rights away from the Germans in the treaty. They did everything they could to prevent the German state from ever being able to start another war, all that. But it was all done diplomatically and through the structure of a treaty, and in such a way as to be considered legal. And they allowed, as long as it was being done through the right diplomatic means, they gave a lot of stuff back to the Germans long before Hitler took power.
That's a good point. Hitler used that to try to get political power. By then, there was already deals that had been reached. And the second Nuremberg trials, by the way, were the lower level guys. Yes. They could not use the justification. The more well-known one of the top guys that they caught, the ones that the CIA didn't help escape. But the lower level ones, the justification that, I had to follow orders, it doesn't apply, not according to the Nuremberg principles. And Chomsky had said once, every U.S. president since World War II would be executed under the Nuremberg principles. And you brought it up on Twitter earlier today, which I thought was a great point, that we haven't arrested any of our former presidents in Peru, for example, or my father's country. I mean, like for the past 20 years, every time a Peruvian president stepped down or finished their tenure, they ended up having to do some jail time for corruption.
Nixon was pardoned by his successor. I mean,
his successor was not elected. Was not elected in Venezuela. When the president dies, you have to have another election. So it's like Jorge Ramos, for example, who's another sellout, right? He did this terrible interview with Maduro where he was trying to provoke him. And in the interview, one of the things he was attacking him for was saying, and you were elected after Chavez died. And you know how I would have retorted? I would have said, yeah, because I'm more democratic than you guys in the United States. Because unlike the United States, when Jackie Kennedy still had her husband's blood on her blouse and they swore in Johnson, there was no president until there was another election. And the Venezuelan people decided that it was going to be Maduro. So, Jorge Ramos is basically a prostitute. People try to use the fact that he has some differences with Trump. He went down to Venezuela at the behest of Trump. He admitted that to Max Blumenthal on the airplane. He said, well, I'm here working with Pompeo and Trump. He was basically sent down there to antagonize Maduro and make him look like a dictator. It was an interview. It was a joke. But
that happens all too often. None of our corporate media, I mean, our corporate media is corporate. That's just the simple fact of it. And
they won't cover the torture. They won't cover, I mean, well, what's going on with Alex Saab. Even when the UN says that Saab and Assange are being tortured, you know, they won't cover it. They'll either omit it or they'll manipulate it in some way.
The reason that I said what I said about, I asked what I asked about Spanish language media in the US being a little right wing, is there's a show that's basically Caso Cerrado. For those people who are watching who don't know what it is, it's basically the Spanish language version of the People's Court.
Yeah, almost like Judge Judy, Caso Cerrado, yeah.
There's real money going on, though. We're not talking about you know, $500 here and there. They're talking about real money in some of these.
Well, I heard that no matter who loses, they pay both sides. These shows are you know, fake. I mean, they're real court cases, but they don't have one lose and one gain. They both gain.
Oh, of course. Because the
same in
people
English,
who show up get paid for showing up, even if they have to pay money. But yeah, no, you're right. But anyway, what I was saying is that the host is great and is really great on gay rights and really great on racism. But if you mention Cuba, she'll start trashing it right away. You mention Venezuela, she'll start.
I mean, Raul Castro's daughter is a lesbian. And she's a gay rights activist.
Yeah.
And Fidel actually apologized for the Stalinist move. He said, you know, we sent gays to exile or rehabilitation camps like they did in Russia under Stalin, and that was a mistake. And he apologized for it.
Yes, he did.
And so, you know, later on, you know, when they were not as extreme, they gave gay rights. I mean, they don't have gay marriage yet, but they certainly had a lot more rights than they did in the 50s. And that's in part because of people, I forget her name, but she's a Castro, Raul Castro's daughter. So yeah, they've made some gains there.
But just how remarkable is it? We talk about, oh, they're dictators. So how often do you hear about any democratically elected American changing their mind on something like that?
Well, I went to Cuba once. I can tell you this.
Way.
The cabinet, for example, right? So when Obama was first elected and picked Geithner of all people to be his treasurer, you remember that? He was the treasurer under Bush as well, Bush II. You know, straight out of J.P. Morgan, and you know, Castro would have never been able to do that. Because all the cabinet, although there's not the presidential election, all the cabinet members are directly elected by the people in Cuba. Did you know that?
Yeah.
And also they have an audit in Venezuela, which is an extremely democratic society, of more than 50% of the vote. It used to be 30%, which was the largest in the world. Now, since the regional elections, it's more than 50%. And that was part of their deal with the opposition. So they were doing a dialogue in Mexico, a very important dialogue with the opposition, with the Venezuelan opposition. And it got sabotaged because Alex Saab was picked as a diplomat of the dialogue. He was already a diplomat since 2018, but they increased his diplomatic status to try to help him get out of Cape Verde. And rather than release him and help these negotiations flourish further, they extradited him to Miami. And of course, Venezuela, then the Venezuelan government was forced to shut down the dialogue. And the United States had sabotaged dialogues prior in Santo Domingo, you know, making calls to the opposition saying, you know, don't run your party, boycott it. And, you know, the United States consistently playing this game that, oh yeah, from behind the scenes, we're going to back, you know, dialogue. And then they do something like this. And there's always ulterior motives. You know?
And let's not underestimate the fact that, you know, nobody interferes in elections in other countries better than the CIA.
That's literally one of the first things they did was a coup, right? They always like to remove people from power. They did it against Mossadegh in Iran. They did it against Arbenz shortly after in Guatemala. You know, Che was there for that.
First two.
Yeah, so that's one of the first things they were dedicated to was removing heads of state, and then later protecting Nazis and getting them out of Europe.
The fun ones, though, those are the ones you know about, and those are the ones that people talk about. We overthrew the Australian government.
I did not know that, but I'm not surprised by it, right? Because look how
it wasn't
how
a
vassal
military
state the
coup or
Australians
anything
are
like that.
against Assange, who's their greatest citizen. They were at least consulted about the plot that Yahoo News revealed against Assange.
So, but yeah, Australia has
it's
been
the same
like
thing
our
with the Colombian regime. Even though Alex Saab was born in Colombia, he still has a Colombian passport besides a Venezuelan. They're not advocating for Saab either because these nations are so sellouts.
Well,
they're going along with it. Yeah.
When you look at some of this stuff, though, Australia is the U.S.'s number one ally in any sort of bad war that we shouldn't be in.
Well,
Australia was the only one of our allies who came to Vietnam with us. They're that.
Remember what Kissinger said? He said, "We have no allies. We only have interests." So a lot of people that were temporary allies later turn on their enemies. Right? Look at Noriega. Look at Guaido. Yeah, I'm telling you, Guaido is going to be abandoned pretty soon by Biden.
Of course. But
they're going to try to find some other guy.
Australia has been our thug essentially.
Right. The dirty wars and all that. Yeah.
They were the only country to go into Vietnam with us.
Interesting.
Originally, they were the only country that was actually contributing troops to Iraq with us.
By the way,
they started building the coalition of the willing.
Was this actually a military coup in Australia, or they backed like
it wasn't a military coup, but it was the US interfering in an election, basically. It was all the stuff we accused Putin of doing for Trump.
Right. It's projection. Yeah.
So it wasn't that they couped Australia in an overt, hard military coup.
Yeah, like Chile or whatever. Yeah.
But if you want to use the American media language of a soft coup, we absolutely helped overthrow that Australian government. We elected the most conservative party, and since then, both the Conservative Party and the so-called Labour Party have been, and the Conservative Party in Australia is the Liberal Party, which is just one of my favorite facts.
That's interesting. And, it's like the Contras in Nicaragua as well, right? The Reagan genocide and in Central America, these Contra thugs, against the Sandinistas, it's like, yes, it was more overt than covert, with Western countries like Australia, but one way or another, the United States is going to meddle. And then when a nation stands up and defies those sanctions and defies the imperial orders of things, then they try to make an example out of their leaders like Saab. So,
and that's the thing. You can see it even in modern history under Clinton. While Bill Clinton was president, the Soviet Union fell. And the Clinton government started immediately pressuring China and North Korea and Vietnam to join the world market, and China knuckled under. And then a few years later, I don't remember if it was while Clinton was president or whether it happened after Bush took office, but then Vietnam knuckled under and joined the world market under agreed upon circumstances that lead to hardcore ultra leftists in the U.S. saying Vietnam and China aren't communist. Dang it!
Well, I'm glad the TPP did not go through, and I don't credit Trump with that. I credit activism for that, for pressuring whoever was going to come. They associated Clinton with it so much, Trump had to do it.
I don't like to over credit Bernie Sanders for things. But I honestly believe that that Bernie Sanders succeeded in turning around public opinion on TPP, because
it wasn't just Joe Stein and left activists. Bernie also took a position on that.
When Hillary Clinton switched from for it to against it in order to stay politically relevant.
Yeah, but nobody took her seriously at that point because she had been so much in favor of like NAFTA and all that,
Nobody took her seriously, but at the same time, that was the sort of thing that really signaled to people, oh, okay, yeah, this is a big deal. And then, yeah. But Vietnam was willing to join the TPP against China, and that's something else to keep in mind.
But they have a very good healthcare system. They've dealt with COVID very well. I'm sure there's divisions between the Chinese and the Vietnamese, but they certainly have a lot of parts of their system that are admirable.
It's old water under the bridge. It's like how still in Russia to this day, Putin will still say in speeches to Russians that the reason they need to get Ukraine back is so that Poland can't invade them.
I was unaware of that, but I'll tell you this. Crimea was always Russian.
Mm-hmm.
Even before the United States existed in the early 1700s, there was a Russian base there. And so a referendum decided, it was like 98.7% to rejoin Russia because they were afraid of the forces that were taking over in Kiev. And then they called that an annexation or an invasion. And that's not really an accurate description.
After Ivan the Terrible died, Russia entered what's called the Troubles. Russia was invaded by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was at the time a superpower, which Russia
was the Orthodox versus the Catholic. So the Lithuanian Polish Catholics were invading the Orthodox. Yeah.
Then they put their guy in power, and there was a period of political domination by Poland. Now this was after Ivan the Terrible died.
It's been a while since that Tsar was around.
Yeah, but when they talk about restoring Russian borders to protect Russia, they talk about being invaded by Poland and Germany.
Well, Germany obviously was much more recent in history, right?
Definitely. Yeah. Well, but Germany and Poland are the two historical Russian enemies anyway.
For a while, that's true.
Ivan the Terrible's big military victory was against Teutonic Knights who were German.
Right. That was during the Holy Roman Empire, I believe.
Yes.
And the last of the Crusades was by Barbarossa. Hitler picked the name Barbarossa for his operation against the Soviets.
After Frederick Barbarossa.
Right. Frederick Barbarossa was the German emperor. That was the third or fourth crusade, one of the last crusades. Right, because the Germans were involved not just in Eastern Europe, but in the Middle East at one point.
He died during a contested river crossing. He was.
If you color your beard red, then you'll also be Barbarossa. That's how you said red beard in Latin, right? Yes. Barbarossa, and the king actually had a red beard, the emperor, and that's why they called him that. Yeah,
exactly. And
but anyways, what's a link to this program so I can share it later? Is it going to be through YouTube or?
Let me go ahead and give you that.
Okay. But yeah, thanks for having me on, man. It was almost 2 hours and it just flew by, man. This has been great. Yeah. It's too bad Kennedy couldn't come back on, but
Kennedy,
I'm sure we'll see the rest of it.
Kennedy had stuff going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I get that. So as far as final thoughts go, I want to get back to Martin Luther King a little bit.
Yeah. I wanted to mention that
was also a socialist. Let's
Let's
remember that. And an anti-imperialist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, he called himself a radical revolutionary, and he called for a radical revolution of values, and he exposed the extreme right. And, you know, he understood the true meaning of radical, right, which comes from the Latin word radic, which means root. So whoever's trying to get to the root cause of societal problems is a radical thinker. And Martin Luther King embraced that. He wasn't always a radical thinker. I think the last year of his life, especially post 65 after Malcolm's assassination, because, you know, shortly before Malcolm's assassination, Malcolm was making steps towards reconciling with Dr. King. They got to meet. You know, they had differences because of the influence of Elijah Muhammad in the Nation of Islam at one point. But, you know, after Malcolm left the Nation of Islam, traveled the world, he was able to.
Strong differences are revolving around nonviolence too.
Well, absolutely. But, you know, Malcolm saw himself by early 65 as an ally of Martin Luther King, because he would scare the whites into thinking we have to follow with whatever Dr. King is saying, because if not, we're going to get these militant Malcolm types. So they were kind of working together on that, and the government couldn't permit them to work together. That's why they ended up taking out Malcolm. They took him out first.
As an interesting fact, the last year of his life, Malcolm started giving speeches to the Socialist Workers' Party.
I know, SWP.
Yeah, and that's That's as open as it
He
gets.
also met Fidel. He almost met Che, but there was like an assassination attempt on Che in New York, and so he couldn't meet with Malcolm that day in Harlem. But he did meet with Fidel Castro in Harlem prior to that in 1960. Malcolm X. His mother's was from the Caribbean, from Grenada. So he had Caribbean roots, and he was an admirer of the Cuban Revolution. And so the point I'm trying to make is the last year of Martin Luther King's life, the SWP and the socialists that were working with Malcolm prior were then working with King. And King saw people's true faces when he came out against the Vietnam War in April of '67, right? Because he was abandoned by his liberal base. All these people, the majority of his allies, abandoned him. Who were the ones that stayed behind him? Were the socialists, were the anti-imperialists, were the more politically militant, the ones that had backed Malcolm. When King realized that, the government forces that took up Malcolm and realized how they wanted to prevent that unity, that really made him more revolutionary. Like Fred Hampton later, who was killed in '69,
which was still actually a syndicalist union then. They had done they had collaborated in some anti-communist stuff because of internal issues, but they were still anarcho-syndicalists in the '60s.
And so, Martin Luther King believed in coalition building.
Yes.
But he saw people's true faces. He saw the hypocrisy of these people that said, you can't be against the war. You can't be against imperialism. That doesn't do with civil rights. And he said, why are you limiting this civil rights? I want to be like Malcolm. I want to go into human rights. I want to go beyond reform. We need to have a whole revolutionary. It's like the United States had a revolution, helped inspire the French. Then the Russians, like, why can't we have another revolution? But not a revolution that's bourgeois, a revolution of the workers with racial harmony and racial unity. That's what Martin Luther King was striving towards. And before he could speak out more and use his prestige as a Nobel Prize winner that he got at the end of '64, then he was taken out. And what people don't realize, and I mentioned in the article today in my blog through WordPress, is that in 1999, after decades of fighting for justice, Dr. King's family was compensated by the U.S. government in a lawsuit. They actually proved in court that the mafia and the feds, the FBI,
and the Memphis
police to kill King, and virtually nobody knows this. And it's just reporting a fact. It's not a conspiracy theory. It was proven in court, and they had to pay millions of dollars restitution.
Yeah, the jury found basically the jury said yes. This meets the burden for civil liability. There was a conspiracy.
And so, you can't even say that there was a probable conspiracy against Fred Hampton when a movie just came out about it, and Fred Hampton's family were part of it. I mean, certain groups of people you can't say about, JFK, RFK, all these leaders within a few years of each other. And it's like, I'm saying, there were forces within our government that didn't want this unity to happen. They wanted to maintain the Cold War. They wanted to maintain the profit for the armaments industry.
I'm from Southern California, and while it's not as well known as Oakland and Chicago, LA had Black Panthers too. The LA Black Panthers were killed by a rival Black nationalist group that was anti-communist, that had been specifically riled up against the Panthers by COINTELPRO operations.
Well, do you know the man that killed Dr. King's mother in a church was a Black?
I think we froze. Sorry about that, folks. I was hoping we could get out in a moment. Alex, you there? Alex, can you hear me? Looks like it's on his side, but not ours, folks. I'll give it another minute or two to see if, well, it looks like we lost him. Sorry about that, folks. Kennedy had to go because of distractions on the side, and it looks like Alex got cut off by technical problems. But I really appreciate you hanging out with us. I really do. Thanks for joining us. And like always, folks, we'll tweet at you.